Testing. 1, 2. Yep, we got something. All right, we're good.
Test 1, 2, test 1, 2. It's blue. Test 1, test 1.
Mic check.
Test 1, test 1. This one's not working at all. Test 1.
Mic check. There it is. Okay. All right. Got it.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How's everybody doing?
Good. Hi.
Great, great. First and foremost, my name is Carla Hines. I'm one of the deacons here at Myers Park Baptist Church. I want to thank everybody for joining us for Talkback. At this time, we actually have Reverend Tara Gibbs, and we take this time to go deeper into the discussion of the Proclaimer. So I want to thank everybody here who is here both personally and virtually for joining us for this deeper dive. We've got some great questions here. I'm going to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question that pops up in your mind and you haven't sent it to us via one of the cards, please just raise your hand. Jason has agreed to do the walking for you, and he will bring the microphone to you. It is always best if we have someone who has a microphone so that everyone can hear, and perhaps it will stimulate an additional question from them. Again, we want to take a deeper dive into that, and so with that, I'm going to turn to Reverend Tara and ask her, what moved you to actually bring this message this morning? Because you started out strong.
And that's always not always the hardest part, but that was definitely the hardest part in writing this sermon was, how do I start? Where do I go? Where do I even just start the conversation about hypocrisy in particular? I think it was just moved from that phrase, again, how it resonated in my own mind, and again, the specific memory I had of New Jersey that I shared with you all, of the gentleman who walked up and said those words. We just talked about this, and I thought about how powerful it was. It was simple and powerful, and that was kind of a basis to get started. And so once I did my Bible reading and really started looking into scripture, I was like, wow, this is, if I had to do my own interpretation of this story with Paul and Peter, that's exactly what happened.
So one of the things that I kept thinking about is in this message about how you challenge us not only in the space to ask that question or to say, we just talked about this, but it also is to hold ourselves accountable. And you ask us, when have we last seen hypocrisy? And then you went on to say, we all are prone to this. And so it's not just looking outside, but it's looking within, and then challenging us about what we can do to change this, to impact change. So I am going to lead out with one of the questions in particular that goes right to the heart of that. Calling out and attempting to shame hypocrisy doesn't seem to be working. What other options might work to help more or move people toward the right direction, or at least a less harsh path?
So let me first by noting that when we look at the way that question said, like shame and harsh, that is examples of already starting to center the feelings of the person doing the oppressing, right? So remember, that was point number 3. That doesn't work. But I will say, as a reminder, that when I advocate for saying we just talked about that, it's specific to a church like this, our context, where we do talk about these things, because I think we all know some places that are shying away from the hard conversations. So that's one thing I do appreciate about Myers Park Baptist, that we are not afraid to have these conversations. So in our context, that works. In other contexts where they're not talking about these things, you can't say we just talked about this, because they're going to say, no, we didn't. What are you talking about, right? So instead, I would say that there's some other avenues, and I'm just always a big advocate for education that comes first. So you do need to talk about it first. So then you have that reference point to go back to for other people and say, okay, remember how we learned about this, how we talked about this, remember when you asked me this, and then you bring that back to people's remembrance so they start to have time to apply. A lot of us, I think, are really prone to want to read and learn and study and discuss, and that's beautiful, and that helps us learn. But at some point, we have to apply it. And having that question even in our own minds, not ready to attack someone else, but in our own minds of, didn't I just read about this? Didn't I just learn about this? Didn't I just engage with this text? Didn't someone just tell me about this? It's just another way to help hold us accountable. The last thing I'll say is that keep in mind, I think particularly in justice work, we have to remember that we're not going to convince everybody. We're not. And I'm not saying that to be defeatist. I'm not saying that to say we need to give up. But we have to kind of pick and choose our battles. For example, I'm a big advocate of Facebook is cool. I'm not arguing with anybody on Facebook. I'm just not. But I do recognize the value sometimes of not necessarily arguing with someone's original post, but just being a dissenting voice or a different perspective in the comments, not necessarily to convince that original person, but that somebody else may see, that somebody else may learn, that somebody else may know. So sometimes, keep in mind, our calling out of hypocrisy is not that we expect to be a complete 180 or a change from these institutions and powers that are huge. They are. That's why they got where they are. They're huge, they're powerful. But it helps other people see so that we can begin to come together and lean into our own power in a way and let some people know that they're not alone. Does that make sense? Okay. Hopefully that helps.
So how do we unlearn the silence that we have ingrained from birth?
That's really good, because I think it is some cultural things to be silent. Many of us were probably raised like with your family, right? There's some things you don't talk about outside of your house. You don't talk about those things with certain people, or even in workplaces, we don't talk about money. We don't talk about politics. So the silence, I do get that, and I understand that. Again, I would lean into, I think it takes practice. You have to do it. I know people got a little chuckle out of me saying, turn to your neighbor and say, we just talked about this. And it was lighthearted in a sense, but I also do believe in the power of practice. Practice makes, not perfect, but practice leads us to getting a little bit closer there. And so the more we do it in our everyday, the more we lean into our power in smaller instances, in smaller areas, then we're more empowered to do in the bigger things. And a lot of that starts with ourselves. How do we talk to ourselves? Even if you don't talk out loud. I have to catch myself, and my partner catches me often, that I'll talk really negative or down about myself, and I hear my own thoughts. And I have to stop them, and I work with my therapist on this. I have to stop them and rebuke that in a sense and talk back to it. So instead of just being silent and letting it be what it is, I have to say, no. That may be how I feel right now, but that is not true. No, I don't have to believe that. No, I'm working on that. I'm not patient now, but I will be one day. So things like that. So I just encourage you to practice. I mean, if you need to do as much as get into the mirror and hear your own voice a little bit more, right? If you need to get with a friend and actually practice and talk out loud and have a conversation, that's okay too. You don't have to be like, I'm an extrovert, outgoing kind of person. You don't have to be me and get up on the pulpit and talk. But sometimes it's more meaningful and more impactful to have the one-on-one conversation with someone over lunch. Sometimes it's more meaningful to just text somebody and check in with them and let them know you're thinking about them and whatever it is you need to talk about. But I would just say, just practice not being silent. Start with the small, and eventually you'll feel more confident and ready to get to the bigger things.
Reverend Tara, you hit the nail on the head for me, because I often attend meetings where there are 20, 30 people who are from different places, different departments I work in. I have relationships with some of those people. One-on-one, I would feel very comfortable saying, you know, I thought we talked about that. Our mission says we're going to do this, challenging them more. And although many who meet me might think I wouldn't bite my tongue at all, there are times that I pause because, one, I question, am I giving enough space for others to bring their opinions to the front of the group? This next question, in fact, is about that. How to give space to new voices and don't hush them with our own.
That is an excellent. It's almost like the antithesis of the other point. So like I said, I'm definitely more of an extrovert, an outgoing person, a people person. So I am more inclined to talk, to say something, to speak up. But my work is I have to learn how to sit back sometimes. I have to learn how to be quiet sometimes. And not just be quiet because I'm like, I wouldn't say something, but quiet and actually and actively listen to other people. That also means I have to be the one to encourage other people to be heard. So if I know I want to say something, it doesn't mean I have to say my thoughts. Instead, I might say, I haven't heard from Carla yet. I'd like to hear from Carla on this. Especially when we can recognize those people who are socially marginalized, historically and traditionally marginalized and oppressed, when we can say, I love that we're talking about these indigenous issues. Can we be sure to hear from an indigenous person? Can I hear from so-and-so at this moment? I love that we're talking about climate change and how it intersects with race. Can we talk about someone who lives this reality? Can we hear from you? I'd like to give them the floor. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this topic, but may I suggest my colleague who is more experienced, who has the lived experience. Thank you for the opportunity to go to this conference. Can I instead pay for someone who's more marginalized to go and make sure they can share in the experience and that their voices are heard in those spaces? We all have some level of privilege, right? And we have to lean into what that is and amplify and intentionally engage and make sure we're encouraging other people's voices to be heard in whatever the situation or the topic is, I'd say.
One of the things that I often find myself doing is simply looking around the table and saying, do we have the right people sitting at the table to have an adequate discussion about these topics? And I think that goes to your point, giving other people voice. I know my perspective, my lens, I know what I read, but it's truly not lived experience. Very frequently, I am asked things because I happen to be the sole African American in that room. And so what I have to be clear about is I'm not an expert. This is my lived experience, and I think it's really important. On this next one, and again, I would encourage folks, if you have questions that are bubbling up, please just raise your hand. There's no certain way that we have to go about this. And Sydney, I'll take yours right now.
I think I'm loud.
It helps recording, for the recording.
I'm just really curious about how this translates what you're talking about, what you were just talking about, to our church, and that we want to engage more people. I want to hear more about what Jason thinks about something, about what anybody here and people who aren't here. I don't want to be, I feel like we've been given a lot of information, we've been taught a lot of things, but it's time to talk those things out with people in our congregation that are here that may or may not be of like mind. So I just been really thinking about that.
Yeah, I love that, Sydney. I think you made a great point. I'm even thinking about the fact that we have a congregational meeting next week, right? I appreciate that in our bylaws and governance and things, we have to announce things a certain amount of time ahead to make sure, one, it's accessible and inclusive. We have to do these discussions of, can we do it in person, but can we stream something? Is there a way to vote when it's time to vote electronically? Because we're trying to give access to those other voices. So to Sydney's point, we don't become what he said, like an echo chamber, right? Where we hear the same people every time and we just keep talking about the things that we want to talk about, but never actually begin to engage. So again, I encourage the church to be intentional in that, right? It's really easy, not just this church, but any institution, any organization. It gets really easy and comfortable, especially, listen to this, when at one point you were the marginalized and silenced voice, but now you've become on the side more of the majority or the more often and the more likely to be heard, right? So there has to be a little inward acknowledgement and noticing of, oops, I'm not as quiet as I thought I was. My voice, my opinions get out there a little bit more. I want to make sure I hear from others in that very vein. So thank you for that. Perfect. There's some more questions. I see Nancy and Seth.
Kind of comment, that was one of my questions, because I know by really my very presence as someone who gets identified as a white cisgender male, that just silences, because people who identify as women or people who are of color have been having to keep silence or play it cool. And I even think of how sometimes even white people demand people of color to like perform of like, oh, you're the voice of color. Do my emotional work for me. I really appreciated in your sermon of how you said we have to decentralize the feelings of the oppressor or the person who's been really profiting off of other people's silence, to not call them out on their hypocrisy or call them out on their position of power. And so that's kind of really more, and I really appreciate what you've said, but it's kind of that nuance of, okay, so we want to hear other voices. We want those other people to feel safe. And we also don't want to use their voice to just exploit so we can just continue and like kind of give our little self that Sunday school sticker that we did that. So how do people like myself, and I know you're asking, this is kind of like going through this, how do we navigate that, and how do we provide those safe spaces?
Great question, Seth. The first two things that come to my mind is, one, I, as one black person, right, never ask a white person or somebody who has different identities than me to necessarily change their identity or be inauthentic, right? So I think that's one thing we have to recognize. There should never be an ask for anyone to be their inauthentic self, right? So if I'm in a space with Seth, I'm never going to be like, Seth, stop being a white man, okay? Just stop it right now. You stop it. You are, and that's okay. But with that, I think there comes the second part, is the kind of just self-awareness with that. So let me say it like this. This sounds harsh, but I'm finding myself to agree with this. You are not responsible for my feelings. It sounds harsh, but listen, you're not responsible for my feelings. I probably, and I do, have trauma and suffering and history with white men. It's not you, right, as a person. You aren't responsible for that. That's for me to work out. That's for me and God. That's for me and my history and my own trauma. The best you can do is to be your authentic self, recognize that that is very likely, historically, that I have this trauma, and make space for that. Give grace for that. So if I do come off a little angry black woman, probably for good reason, right? If I do come off, there's Seth again, that's probably for good reason. If I'm like, I don't think I want to partner with him right now, let me find somebody else to partner with, it's probably for some reason. So again, in that decentering, recognizing it's not something personal, right? It's not you, but sometimes there's some deeper things that people have and are going with, and that's with anything. We all have, what did I say, a life and experiences that you have no idea that someone has gone through. And so you can't be responsible for that necessarily, but you can do your part to make sure you can't 100% make a space 100% safe, but you can do your best to be as safe as person as possible, and recognize that there are some spaces you just have no business in. There's some spaces I have no business in as a black cis queer woman, and that's okay. I don't need to be in every trans space. I can be a great ally sometimes, but I don't need to be in every space, okay, to do that. And that's usually the best way sometimes to offer that safety and to advocate for that safety. Again, leaning into my own privileges to be able to tell someone else that, hey, this is a trans group that's meeting. We should wait over here. You know, they're having a conversation and saying, let's just take a step over here, because this is not about us right now. And they're not including me, and they're not, I want to be in. And who said I can't go? No one. But recognizing that maybe there needs to be a moment of safety. I think about women, right? We like to have women only kickboxing and things like that. It's not that nobody wants a man. It's, can we just have this safe space for just a few minutes and know how to protect ourselves against you? Just a few minutes. Is that helpful? Okay. Nancy was next, I believe.
A microaggression came to my attention about 2 months or so ago. It was in the sanctuary in which a biracial couple When we were doing passing of the peace, there were folks around that pew that didn't shake hands with the interracial couple. They shook hands with everyone around them but them. And I was so angry when I heard that, and when I went home, and it's just stuck in my head about how do we, our church says it over and over and over again. So obviously that message has not gotten to that person or that couple. So then what is my obligation? And after hearing you and thinking about this, I think there's really nothing I can do about that person that doesn't shake hands or embrace the diversity that we believe is God's kingdom. I think what I have to do is get up and go shake that couple's hands myself, that I pay attention to the people that are sitting in this sanctuary. And talking about an angry black woman, I can be an angry black white woman. And it really makes me angry that we can't get that message through or done, but all I can do is do what I believe this church is calling us to be and to do.
Amen. I love that you brought up, Nancy, something that I remind people when people want to say, oh, I want to be colorblind, or that doesn't matter, we don't see those things. As a church, when we say we are open to all, we're not saying that we don't see color, we don't see disability, we don't see gender or sexuality. It's saying that those things aren't restrictive, because if you don't see those things, you don't see the people. If you weren't noticing that, you would have never noticed that that's likely why they were being discriminated against. We have to see that. If you don't see people's identities, then you don't see the person. And you don't see how the world discriminates against them, and you just write it off, you minimize, right? And just say, they probably didn't mean that. It wasn't because they're a woman, they just didn't want her to preach. They didn't want her to lead. When in reality, we're saying it probably is because she's a woman, right? Or it is because they're African American. It is because they have a disability. Excellent. Thank you, Nancy.
Nancy, one of the things that I struggle with is just reminding myself, and obviously I'm not in the ministry or anything, but I always continue to challenge myself to how do you reach out to people individually and ask why? Just why? I'm not confronting them in an angry way, but why? And I know you've been a member of the church for quite some time, and sometimes it is those relationships and having that one-off conversation with the person, say, you know, I noticed this happened, or I heard this happened. Can you tell me about it? Was it interpreted incorrectly? Was it you didn't see the person? Even if the person did it and didn't intend to do it, it does make them think. It does make them think. You could have that conversation far easier than I could, because I might not know that person. So I often look at my circle of influence, and I always challenge myself when we get up and we shake hands. I force myself to go to people I don't know. I do try and see and shake hands with the people I do know, so I won't think I'm pissed off at them or anything. But I try intentionally to go to the back to find people I don't know, so I can maybe remember a face, maybe make a connection, so I can spread my circle of influence, because it's gotten bigger and bigger with each month that I've been here, and I keep hoping that's how I impact change. Because if I can have a one-off conversation, not hold people accountable in a group of people, that drives them away from the church. But how can I have a conversation that's not antagonistic, that's not one that is calling you out because you did a wrong thing? You may just question, say, I just noticed this. What, was there anything going on? There is a way to approach people, I think, and I've tried to practice it over time. But it is hard, because I often feel like I'm in this battle alone. And I'm not trying to say that I'm any better than anyone, but sometimes I'm like, did you guys catch that? You know, why would that happen? And then there are other times when it doesn't hit me at all, Where someone else, based on Reverend Tara's experience, she may have a very different lived experience than I do, and I miss it altogether. And people will come and apologize to me, and I will say, I didn't take it that way. I missed it. And it doesn't mean I'm less of a person or my experience is any less than hers. It's just different. Like yours is different and yours is different. It's just different.
I'm glad you brought that up, Carla, because I fear as I think about it now, people are going to take me 100% literally when I say, didn't we just talk about that and going up and shaking someone? You don't have to do that. But it is phrasing a question like, didn't we just talk about this, or we just talked about this, right? To say that it's trying to bring back that person's remembrance. Like, okay, if we are, let's say for us as an example, a church that keeps talking about this, when are we going to do it? Right? So you can just hold someone accountable in a way that says, okay, now I heard you say that you love everybody, yet I see you treating so-and-so like this. Help me understand that, right? It doesn't have to be like, confrontational. Some people do need a little, but not everyone. Not everyone needs a little, especially because here's the thing. It's not always the people that are, and like that, and that we're strangers or we don't know, or politicians and stuff that are hard to, raise a fist at and say, do better. It's usually the people that are our friends. It's the people we see every day. It's the people right among us. Another reason why I really appreciate this Paul and Peter example, because they knew each other, right? They were friends. They hung out together. So it wasn't let me just shake an angry fist at someone over there who I'll never see again and let them know how I feel. It was, I need to correct you and hold you accountable because I love you, because I'm in relationship with you. Right? And part of that on the other side means that we have to be humble enough to be corrected. We have to be humble enough to want to listen to other people. And it's hard, but that's how we get to beloved community. We have to that question and that point about the silence, we have to learn how to have a conversation and not think because we had a heated conversation that we hate each other now and we'll never have dinner again. Right? We have to learn how to share those things and have those conversations and say, thank you, Carla. I appreciate that. You're right. I really went off there about that. Do you want to go get pizza? Right?
And you give space when you tell someone you're not responsible for my feelings. How I react, how I feel is based on my experience and the things that trigger for me, but you're not necessarily responsible for them.
The feelings, let's be clear, not the actions,
Yeah,
the feelings.
So here's our next question. I live and work in spaces where people have not just talked about this. What suggestions do you have for holding ourselves and others accountable in spaces where oppressors' feelings are centered and insulated?
So if I'm understanding the question, it's not that they're not even having the conversations about these things? Okay. So similar to, and I'm happy to talk to this person a little bit more detailed one-on-one afterwards if you like, but similar to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, sometimes, again, you have to recognize that there's some people and some institutions, some powers you're not going to shift and you're not going to change. Again, not to be defeatist, not to give up or anything, but to recognize where do you have power? Where can you have the conversation? Where can you start? So if you work for Bank of America, that's a huge company. You could shake your fist at them all the time about, we just talked about this, right? They're gonna have their Rainbow Pride logo this month and then they're gonna take it down on July 1st, right? They're going to give money to a black organization in February and then they're gonna lay off some black people in February. Yeah. So what can maybe one lone person that works at a local branch necessarily do? To the big institution, probably not a whole lot. But what they can do is look at those relationships they already have, start with the one-on-one conversation, and keep in mind, even if you don't change the larger scale, there's someone else watching, there's someone else listening, and there's someone else learning from you. And that's important because a lot of times we do feel alone. I think you mentioned that earlier. We feel like we're the only ones, but you need to hear someone else's voice saying, well, I know that wasn't right. Yeah, I thought so too, right? That's at least two more people. So the more we say it, maybe there's a third person now. Yeah, I didn't think that was right either. And it grows and it shifts and it gets up to a manager and it gets up to a branch manager and it gets up to a regional leader and it gets up to Brian Moynihan, right? Is he still in charge? I think so, I don't know. I used to work at Bank of America many moons ago. So we have to be patient. We have to understand. I love that text that says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And it's not meant to discourage us to say, well, there's always going to be something out there and we just don't have enough people. It means that the people that we do have are going to have to make as much impact and quality impact as they can, little by little.
Sydney, I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned about how do we talk about it, start talking about these things as a congregation. You know, one of the things that I am very hopeful for is that our ministries will start getting more people involved. The various ministries, you know, that do a lot of things in the church, rather than going back to the faithful few who are involved, that we work to get people who have a lot to offer, who have different perspectives. That's how you get people talking about it. It can't just be the ones who are always at the helm, who are always leading things, but it's got to be people that we engage them enough so that they can become part of our ministries, have their discussions within the ministries, talk to other people in their circles, and start talking about how we impact change as a church. And so for me, that's how we start really having some deeper discussions about these things. So this is, I think you've covered part of this, but what actions should follow? Didn't we just talk about this? Specifically, how do we generate movement? What tips do you have?
Tips do I have? I think it does depend on the context, of course, of when you're saying, didn't we just talk about this? For example, if you're talking to an individual, a peer, a colleague, a friend, then your follow-up is going to be a little bit different than if you were the gentleman addressing the United Methodist Church up in New Jersey a few years ago I told you about, right? But I think the couple tips I would say is kind of like what you already mentioned, I think, is first is to get into that person's head, like, really, what is the disconnect here for you? And you'd be surprised, a lot of times people really just need somebody to connect the dots. I think that's what happened up in New Jersey, where people heard this great presentation by Rob and D'Angelo and were like, this was informative, this was helpful, and then they just stopped. So then when it came time to the vote, they didn't know how to apply what they literally had just heard until someone said, didn't we just talk about this? And they said, oh, we did. And that's when they voted affirmatively, because they said, oh, it wasn't meant to shame people. It wasn't meant to go feel bad and just leave the church and you're losing all your credentials or anything, right? And in UMC, it just meant, oh, I needed this moment to recognize where this is happening. So sometimes with one-on-one peers, we can do that too. We can say, now, as my friend, you just said that you were going to give that up. You just said that. What's going on? Are you stressed? Is that what's causing you to get back to this habit perhaps, or addiction, or whatever it may be? Not in a judgmental tone, but this is what you told me. If that's changed, that's fine. Just giving back to you what you told me, right? And that can just start a conversation and let people be more willing. Again, I think the biggest tip, I guess, is the underlying tip here, I'll say, is conversation. People are afraid to talk to people. And honestly, as somebody who works with youth, it is really concerning how afraid they are to talk to people. They will not call to make appointments. They will not follow up with people. They are afraid. And we're not a lot better, honestly. We are afraid of confrontation. We're afraid of conflict. And so the more we practice that every day, the little things, then we can get to the bigger things, I think. So hopefully that helps someone. I'll keep thinking about it some more, though. It's a great question. The follow-up to not just, didn't we just talk about that, but making the connections for people explicit. Make it explicit, saying, we just said we are open to all, and now you're saying not these people. How does that work? That's it.
Any other questions from the audience? Any other questions? So a couple of things that were related to the program. Someone asked if you could tell us a little bit more about Frederick Douglass.
Okay. Not a historian, but thank you for asking. Here's what I do know, but I encourage you, he's written a number of at least 2, I believe, autobiographies. So they'd be worth reading his narrative and his life. But Frederick Douglass was born enslaved, I believe, in Maryland. I want to say, I'm not 100%, I believe it's Maryland. And he actually got his freedom in 1838, I do know that. And once he was free, he used his privilege and power to become an abolitionist. He advocated for the freedom of his people. I love this insert that we put in the bulletin today. I actually chose it for this because in my mind, Frederick Douglass was telling those people at the 4th of July celebration, didn't we just talk about this? You're talking about freedom and liberty. And he's like, I have siblings and cousins and things literally right now cooking your food for your celebration, right? Sweating over hot stoves, out in the fields, picking out cotton and things to make clothes while you go celebrate this idea of freedom. So I think he was also, he did some preaching, a lot of speeches, but mostly known as an abolitionist. I would just encourage anyone to read more about Frederick Douglass. He lived a very long life and a very impactful one.
So if we, last call for questions. Last call. Okay. I want to thank everyone for their time. What we're going to do, hopefully when you walk away from here, you are prepared to say, did we just talk about this? Also, if you walk away and you want to come back, I do have an announcement. This afternoon, Mojo and the Dignity and Decarceration Project will be showing a film, the short, Racist Roots. And is that at 3 p.m. This afternoon? Does anybody have a time?
3:30.
At 3:30 this afternoon? Okay. So if you are so inclined, please come back and join them for this great, and it's going to be in Heaton Hall.
Yes.
It's going to be in Heaton Hall. All right.
You'll see where it is. It's in the education building.
It's in the education building. Sorry about that.
We went back and forth, that's why. We had to move some things around. But,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for your
Thank you all
attention.
for your questions.
Thank you, Reverend Tara.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your questions.